industry association that represents Canadian food and beverage manufacturers. So what that essentially means, I'm a member-based organization, and my members are companies that manufacture food or beverage products here in Canada, and also provincial associations that represent those same countries across this country. I'm joined here today by three wonderful panelists who I've had a chance to get to know earlier this week. So at the far end, I've got Ross Johnston, who's the Executive Director of Co-operative Education at the University of Waterloo. Beside him, I have Ginette Brown, who is the Manager of People and Values at Riverside Natural Foods Product in Vaughan, Ontario. And then Carson Walsh, closest to me, who is a process engineer with Mondelēz International and has actually works at the Cadbury plant. So we had a great conversation about that this morning. So a little bit about the food and beverage manufacturing sector. So it was talked about earlier today. Food and beverage manufacturing is in fact the largest manufacturing sector in Canada. Really my day job in Ottawa is working on policy and advocacy. So essentially a lobbyist on behalf of this sector, and work with the federal government on trying to advance policies that in turn can help this industry stay competitive and grow. One of the big challenges we have from a competitiveness standpoint is around labor. So if I talk to any of my member companies, virtually all of them will say that the top issue, or one of the top issues that preoccupies them, is the labor situation in the industry and in their companies specifically. And this manifests itself very differently for different companies. So for some it's about finding workers, for others it's about retaining workers, for others still it's about how do we ensure that our workers have the right skills, particularly in an environment where we're seeing a lot of evolution towards food safety, emphasis on food science, and of course looking at automation and adoption of digital technologies as well. One of the challenges we faced, and I'll just ask our lovely tech team if they could advance the slide for me. And this is in fact the only slide I'm going to have up for you today. One of the challenges that we discovered when we started working on labor is that labor is this sort of massive category, and labor manifests itself very differently depending on who you are, where your company is in terms of its size, its growth cycle, regionally where it's located across the country. And so my board really sent me away and said, listen, try to explain this labor problem to us in a way that we can understand. So we created a model, and this is really our labor model, if you will, and it's our way of trying to compartmentalize, artificially in some respects, the labor problem in a way that is absorbable for most of us in our minds. And we literally went through a stack of reports that we found over the past decade, strategies, white papers on labor, and we identified a number of core themes and really discovered that there's probably 6 different areas of work that have to take place for us to really resolve our labor challenge. And as we heard this morning, what we're looking at down the road is a minimum of at least 65,000 jobs that we are having to fill probably in the next 7 years to a decade. That need to fill jobs is also exacerbated by, not exacerbated, but the challenge has been increased by the fact that Canada's Agri-Food Economic Strategy Table, as mentioned earlier, has challenged our sector to in fact grow our domestic production and our export sales by about 30% in just the next 7 years. So as an industry already challenged to resolve our labor problems, we really need to get a handle on what is going to have to take place structurally for us to resolve this problem. We, as I said, have identified 6 different areas, I call them bubbles, where work has to take place. And those are organized around 2 themes. So the first theme is really around talent attraction. And that's the idea of, as people have talked about already, we're not necessarily an industry that people think about first and foremost when they want a job, or when they want a job even in the manufacturing sector. So what are we able to do collectively to increase the profile of this industry so that we're able to attract workers? And also in our second bubble, what does it look like from an HR standpoint and a culture standpoint that allows us to retain those workers? The second theme that we have identified where work needs to be done is really workforce development. How do we actually go in and identify ways to expand the labor pool through things like, as you can see here, underrepresented groups? We talked about that a little bit earlier in terms of recent immigrants to Canada. How do we look at our foreign worker programs? People think of that as the temporary foreign worker program or immigration streams that can in fact expand that pool of labor. Another angle on this as well is skills training, because obviously as an industry that evolves, you're not just looking for warm bodies, you're looking for people who can actually come in and have the skills that you need to get this job done, and you need to do that in an environment where skills are training. And so finally, the area that we look at, we call automation. I think it's even broader than that, innovation you can think of. And so automation, interestingly, touches us in a number of areas. One, in some respects, it can limit the number of jobs that we need to fill, which can be a good thing in an industry that is struggling to meet its labor needs. But at the same time, automation obviously changes the skills that we're looking for. So what I wanted to do first was introduce you to the model. This is how we think about labor in terms of the food companies that come around the table to talk about this problem. And I have with me today these three wonderful representatives of industry who touch on different of these bubbles. I want to make really clear, I haven't come across anybody in this country that does work in each of these 6 areas, and that's one of the big problems we have. There's tons of great work being done at the company level, through groups like Food Processing Skills Canada, through government departments. But what happens when we don't actually integrate all these bubbles together and understand how they fit? And this is a puzzle, if we're going to resolve it, that needs us to work on all of these pieces together. So what I would like to do for the panel is have 2 sort of discussions separately. The bubbles obviously interact with each other, but we're going to start and have a conversation for about 12, 15 minutes on talent attraction, and then flip and do one on the themes that are under workforce development, and you're allowed to move around. But what I want to do first, I've got great questions for them. I can read the bios for you, but I think it would be better for everyone if you can actually speak for yourselves about who you are. So we'll start with Ross and move down. And I think what I'm most interested in is understanding what's your connection to labor. What sort of pieces of this model are you most focused on? And just sort of in a nutshell, what do you see as sort of maybe the greatest opportunity or challenge that we're facing right now?
Thanks very much, Kathleen. My name is Ross Johnston. Good morning. I'm Executive Director for Co-operative Education at the University of Waterloo. Prior to that, I've been in recruitment and also in training and development. So moving into my role 10 years ago, I was astounded to find out just the size and scale of the operation that went on at Waterloo. I think it is a pride institution for Canada to have. It was the first institution in Canada to provide cooperative education over 60 years ago. And at that time, it was basically felt that, this was an institution that was a bit of an upstart. It was doing something that was totally different. But what we're finding now, 60 years on, that this is now the sort of cutting edge in what post-secondary education is really trying to strive for here in Canada, with all institutions really trying to find opportunities for work-integrated learning for their students to enable that integration into the workplace, so that every Canadian grad will graduate with having had some form of work-integrated learning in that experience in their journey through post-secondary. So really for us, we tie in with skills training before they actually hit the workplace, but we're also heavily involved in terms of working with HR departments on attraction strategies and how to attract that up-and-coming new talent that's going to be hitting the workforce. Because by the year 2025, we're forecasted here in Canada to have 75% of our labour force will be millennials. So we're here to help that integration. And those are probably the areas that we touch on.
That's great. Thanks, Ginette.
Good morning. My name is Ginette Brown. I'm the Manager of People and Values at Riverside Natural Foods. I think you may know one of our most popular brands, Made Good, the granola bars and so on. I've been with the company for about 9 months. I've been in HR for about 15 years. This is the first time in my career where I've been really focusing on culture. Just because I walked into an incredible culture, and one of the things that we're trying to do is, because the company is growing at such a fast pace, about doubling every year, we want to make sure that we hold on to the culture that we have, the strong core values that we have as we continue to grow. That's one of the most important things to us, as well as being more engaged in the progressive HR practices. We're always trying to be ahead of the curve in terms of the fundamentals of HR and always pushing forward.
Thanks very much. Carson.
Thank you. So my name is Carson Walsh. I have a degree in engineering from the University of Guelph. I've spent about 6 years working in various food manufacturing facilities. I've worked in cheese, biscuits, and now in chocolate. I'm a process engineer at the Cadbury Chocolate Factory. The two things on here that jump out to me would be skills training and automation. So one of the big roles of my job is to take the culture of the facility away from having operators where you're pushing the button, starting the machine, to skilled technicians who know the machine better than anybody else in the facility.
That's great. So the one thing that I'm particularly interested in, and especially Ross, I mean, you have your entire career is built around trying to find placements for co-op students, and that includes, in your case, engineers, for example. And when I talk to companies in our industry, even on my board of directors, you know, they are finding a real challenge in attracting workers for some of these skilled jobs. And I'm just really curious if you can maybe comment on what your practical experience is when you go out and say to somebody, hey, why don't you go work in the food industry? What's the impression and what are the barriers? You know, why are we not actually making the matches that obviously we seem to have potential for?
I think the most common thing that I find when I chat with potential employers is I haven't come across an institution yet who doesn't want to hire the brightest or the best. So there's the challenge straight off the bat. It's extremely competitive, and we find that you know, we work with organizations to try and enable access to our students. We're always open to work with organizations in terms of how they can provide information about their brand and about their culture and about their organization. We have about 3,000 students that actually go out to work in the manufacturing industry. That was stats from last year. And I think there's real opportunities here for this industry because there was only 350 students that actually went to work in the food and beverage industry. So there's a huge, huge opportunity. There's a growing amount of students that I would say that are working in the sort of process side. We've got about 150 first work term students that take advantage of that. What we find is that we have a large number of students who come into programs where to get in they've had to devote a lot of their time to their studies and their grades. And as a result of that, they've had to sacrifice the opportunity to do part-time work. So that means that when they enter the university, they don't actually have that work experience to offer an employer. However, there is the opportunity to work on the front end. And as Carson said, being an engineer, having the opportunity right at that front end to engage in the process and engage in a team environment, but also, I believe, in terms of engaging of how to communicate with that front-end worker is hugely important for their careers in the future. So I think there's a massive amount of opportunity for this industry. There's a breadth and depth as well of the different programs. At the university, we have over 120 different co-op programs with over 21,500 students that will actually go out to work this year. So there's a whole breadth there. I know that some of the programs is currently being hired in food and beverage, ranges from the sciences, ranges from engineering, which we spoke about, but also finance, environment, and also programs such as kinesiology, where it ties in health and safety in the workplace. So I think there's a vast opportunity. It's about broadening that mind. I know that Mark touched on relevance. So it's about working with us to understand how you can come across as being relevant to this young upcoming population. They are lifelong learners, and I know that Mark touched on that a bit, but they're really looking for that connection and how they can grow. And every single student I've met, they all remember that first work term because that was an organization that gave them the chance. So if we can enable you to keep connected with that talent, then it increases that potential pool.
And I know my board met last week, and we had the same conversation where I had, in fact, my chair, who's a CEO at Maple Lodge Farms, was talking about the importance of when they have interns in, they really view them as part of their potential future stream. I just want to flip to Carson for a minute, because you have this unique experience of having recently, more recently than me, been a student who sort of was looking for career opportunities, and now you actually are on the other side of that fence, if you will, and are an engineer in this industry. But when you were a student and you thought about this sector as a potential career option, was this an obvious choice for you? And how do you think that even today, as you're trying to fill jobs, the people that you're approaching think of us?
Yeah, so as we all know, the food industry does struggle with its image in some parts. And I think I'd pull out more of the corporate functions, like the sales and marketing. Those seem to do pretty well in terms of talent attraction, but more the frontline operations, supervisors, mechanics. The thing I hear a lot is that it doesn't feel like a modern career. And in that sense, the modern side, so if Ross posted one of his co-op positions as a continental night shift position, I don't think, even if it was a great company, I don't think it would see a lot of interest. Working the continental night shift seems like something that my grandfather did. And at our factory, which is 100 years old, we have generations and generations of families that have had their families work at the facility, but the newer generation is kind of missing there. And similar to that, the career side of it, growing up as a millennial, you're told, you're going to change your jobs every 5 years. You're not going to stay in the same place forever and ever. But on the operations side, that's kind of what it feels like is, I'm here, my parents worked here for 60 years, I'm going to work here till I'm from 18 till I retire. So I think that's where we struggle a little bit with the imaging.
So I really now then absolutely want to jump to Ginette, because Ginette, your company, Riverside, is so unique in that you are in a high growth mode and maybe you could talk about that a little bit, and sort of constantly looking for new workers. And you seem to have had a lot of success in both attracting workers and be able to keep them, but you have this magic recipe that I'm intrigued by, and I wonder if you can talk about that, because clearly values and culture are top of mind for your organization.
Absolutely. Culture is critical for retaining and attracting talent. One of the things that we do, we have core values, which the three founders, the three siblings who founded Riverside, they came up with these core values day one. So they have been part of the organization for the last 6 years, governing all sorts of decisions related to people, who stays, who goes, that sort of thing. And using those core values in the recruitment process and screening people against those, I think has been a huge factor in how we've been able to build such a strong team.
And can you just talk about, you used the core values in attracting, but I was really fascinated, and I had this conversation with everyone on the panel, like to what extent, because obviously in the sort of talent attraction phase, this is sort of like robbing Peter to pay Paul. We're trying to attract people away from other industries and other potential jobs to work with us. And so what is that balance between what we think of as a traditional benefits package, pay, health coverage, versus the culture, and particularly in the context of, as you're saying, millennials, and that really being sort of what we think of as maybe the bulk of our supply possibility?
So, I mean, we have a standard benefits package. That's not really where we engage the conversation when we're attracting someone. We're talking about the career development. We're talking possibilities for that person, that trajectory that they could follow. We talk about that we're B Corp. We talk about that we're triple bottom line. Those are the types of things that people are interested in. They're interested in working for a company that has a social conscience, and we really walk the talk when it comes to those things. And I find that that's really where people start to care, and they start to become very engaged and be interested in joining the company.
And Ross, do you find that, like, when you're talking to students, or are the students in a position where they're just happy to get a co-op job, or do you actually find them talking to you about what I mean, are they thinking of these placements as potential career paths? And if they are they at even that sort of early stage of their pre-career thinking about things like culture? I mean, are the millennials different from what my generation was?
Each student sort of follows their own path, Kathleen. So you'll have a student who, you know, I've met in a workplace where this was their 5th work term with the same employer. And they'd really found a solid fit for them. They enjoyed the work, and they knew that they were going to get hired at the end of it, and they were really pleased with that. Other students, they'll like to basically use their work terms, because they'll do between 4 and 6 work terms as part of their journey. So their degree means that they do 5 years instead of 4. But when they graduate with up to 2 years worth of work experience. And the fact that they're also coming to you with having worked with potentially on average 4 different organizations, as well as across 3 different industries, that depth of knowledge that they bring, plus as well in terms of some of the challenges that HR faces is retention. If you're hiring someone, say from a post-secondary that's had the opportunity to rotate around various workplaces, there's a higher likelihood that they're going to stay longer with you because they already know that the grass may not be greener elsewhere. So students will tend to follow their own path, Kathleen, and I think that you know, that is really down and determined. What was also mentioned is about values. That is a big thing with millennials and also Gen Zs coming forward. That tends to be the #1 attractor that we're hearing back from the students. So if you can promote strong values, and not just promote it, you can actually see, live it, and breathe it, and bringing students that's potentially worked in your organization in to promote that back to students is also a way that you'll be able to attract them.
I'm going to, we have limited time, and I want to sort of flip into this workforce development theme, and they're very interconnected, so I'm going to actually start with a question that builds on that. And so under the workforce development, that's really where we're looking at making sure we do have the right numbers of people and that they're appropriately skilled. And so that is, you know, skills development, obviously, but also what's the role of automation in terms of skill development and also culture. And I want to actually go to you, Carson, because I'm really curious. I mean, you're a company that has sort of an existing workforce. It's a company that's been around for a long time, Mondelēz. And you are having to deal with, I presume, introducing new millennials into that workplace. But also as you see this shift, as the industry is shifting more towards food science, food safety, automation, and dealing with an existing workforce. And what does that look like for you in terms of training? And what does that look like in terms of how the existing employees are dealing with that shift from a cultural standpoint?
Yeah, so okay, a lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
So in terms of the new millennials coming into work, I've found that they are the best ones to pick up on the training. In terms of the training, manufacturing has no more real secrets in how to do it well. Our stuff is all focused around, you know, lean, TPM, all the kind of established manufacturing paradigms. We find that the millennials who come in pick it up really quickly, and they're engaged. It's kind of stuff that they have learned using automation growing up. The challenges are more for our established workforce, where this is a new thing. They've gone from being, you know, maybe a strong back or someone who's not so much using their mind at work, and that's really what we're trying to unlock is not so much the hands. We're trying to use people's minds to make the equipment better every day.
And then for all of you, a question, just in terms of skills, because one of the themes that has come up for me in a lot of conversation I have with people is not necessarily what we think of as the skills, like how do I work this computer or run that line, but from a leadership and a management perspective, as some of the jobs are becoming less about sort of, you know, basic physical operations, if you will. And I wonder, maybe Ginette, you can start by commenting on that, because that almost every meeting I go to now, that comes up as a theme about leadership and management training.
Yes, well, we have a 1-year leadership training plan, where we've got an external consultant coming in every quarter to do some very specific leadership training around management, giving feed forward now in terms of performance management, not feedback, how to manage change within your team, and then breaking out into smaller groups just to give people that support. One of the key things that people are needing help with is emotional intelligence as well, because you can have someone who is very strong in terms of their competencies, but if they do not have the emotional intelligence, they're not going to be a strong leader, they're not going to be a good people developer, and that's where we're going. To be a good manager, you need to be a good people developer.
Ross, I'm curious when you are, I mean, I know that a lot of the students that you're looking at co-op placements for our industry would be engineering students, but you know, they ultimately, I suspect, are going to be in management positions or leadership positions, and to what extent do you actually build that into your programming?
Within their co-op journey, they go through what we call WAT-PD, so that stands for personal development, and there's different component elements to this. They'll take a range of courses. They'll actually take them out when they're in the work term. And it'll be things like conflict management, how to communicate, picking up on various aspects that's required within being a strong and a good leader once they actually graduate and they move forward in their career. And these are also creditable programs, so they count towards their eventual degree credit. And it's been built with feedback and input as well from employers and organizations.
And do you find, and this is for all of you, like as so the required skill set is shifting, and the conversation that takes place between industry or companies and academic institutions, are you finding that there is a strong conversation that's taking place there so that the training is consistent with what is needed? And I suppose in other respects, you could have situations where for smaller companies in particular, it's the person who is educated who may be actually driving some of the change in the company and making them aware of that. So what is that sort of interaction looking like right now? And I'll start with you, Ross, and we'll move down.
I think it's fair to say that this has been a growing conversation. It's got a bit still to go. As Mark had touched on, every sort of post-secondary is working on a set of what they're calling learning competencies. So we're basing it at university around a sort of future skills framework. This is something that's tied into a set of competencies that would be used in program development, right through as well to ongoing lifelong learning. But at the same time, it would be used as part of, for students to develop what their learning goals will be when they go out onto the workplace for a work term, but also part of the evaluation back from the employer on how the student has performed against those competencies. So it's a case of trying to tie the whole thing in. When it touches into leadership, it looks at self-leadership and self-awareness. We've worked with input from all stakeholder groups, including employers, including faculty, including students, and we've looked at up to about 19 different formats of these competencies. Wow. So it's still in development. We are aiming to launch it by fall of next year, but we really see this as a component of tying it in, but at the same time setting up advisory councils from each stakeholder group. So if anybody out in the room here would like to be engaged or have input to some of that, then you can certainly reach out and connect with me, because we're trying to draw more organizations and industries into that discussion.
And Ginette, I want to maybe just twist the question a little bit differently for you, because you're such a unique phase in terms of growth. So presumably you're filling lots of different kinds of positions. And so I'm curious across the board, what's your experience in finding people, and then also what is your experience in terms of what their training looks like? Are they coming to you trained? Is that something that you're having to invest in? And what does that look like for you?
We're actually recruiting people who already have the training that they need, who have the past work experience that's related to what we're doing, simply because, we just don't have the time to train people up and to teach them and to let them grow into a role that we already have open for, 9 to 12 months. That said, what we do then is we work with where they're at when they come in, and then we look at the trajectory, and we have one-on-one monthly discussions. Everyone has that with their manager, where one of the things that we cover off is their career progression, the types of things that they want to do in the organization, where they see themselves in 6 months, 2 years, to then support them moving forward.
And I'm actually, Carson, I'm going to flip streams just a tad, just recognizing time. One of the bubbles here I really want to focus on is this idea of underrepresented groups. And that, one of the themes that often comes up in conversations I'm in is that to get more workers, we're going to have to be far more creative and think outside of what what the normal channels that we might go through. And I just wanted to ask you a bit about with Mondelēz and in your plant in particular, are there measures in place for that, or what is your experience in terms of the workers that you're actually able to find and where they're coming from?
Yeah, so we in the past typically have been staffed by people's families and generations coming down. Recently, though, maybe past 5-10 years, that hasn't been the case. So places that we're finding most of our new people coming on are actually new Canadians, and not from necessarily the traditional places. We have, I think, 3 new people from Ireland who just started. They came over 6 months ago just looking for something new, and this was a place they wanted to join. So
I wanted to follow up with you, Ginette, on that as well, because I know you've sort of got an interesting experience as well in terms of where your labor supply is coming from now.
Yeah, we do have a lot of first-generation Canadians or newcomers to Canada, but they have the related work experience.
Yeah.
So a lot of our production workers are new Canadians. We have some people in the office, our salaried positions, who are also new Canadians as well.
And then Ross, for you, because you also have sort of a stream of foreign students, and I'm curious about that as well, because it ties in as well.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that across Canada, post-secondary institutions have had budget challenges, or budget cuts, I should say. So to look at how they're going to attain revenue, there's a big strategic focus on opening up more to international students for the fees that they will pay coming in. At our university for Co-op, what happens there is that when the students enters the country and they attain their study visa, we're also working so that it enables them to get their work visa as well, for certainly working within Canada. And what we find is that these increasing numbers of foreign students, around about 60% of them want to remain in Canada once they graduate.
That's interesting. And so we're really close to the end of our time, so I just want to ask sort of one more question for each of you, and I'm going to start with Ginette. If you can think of, I suppose, from your perspective as an HR professional, obviously in your company now, but throughout the course of your career, if we want to sort of solve the labor challenge, which is in a nutshell making sure we've got enough workers, that they're appropriately skilled workers, what are sort of like 1 or 2 things that you think, or areas you think we could be focusing on, not necessarily the company level, but more at an industry level, more broadly?
Fair living wage would be one. Culture would be another, and just development, training and development.
Okay, Ross?
Yeah, I would say values, creating that sense of community. Students really get a buzz out of working in teams and feeling part of something that's progressive and not just a number. That sense of being able to contribute and showing that they can truly add value, that's an enabler that will actually get them to come back and work for you.
And best for last, Carson. Youngest for last.
So I would say career development. I loved hearing what Ginette had to say about talking to the colleagues and saying, where do you see yourself in 6 months, a year? I think if there is a way to connect frontline workers to other opportunities, other facilities, to motivate them to develop their skills for something farther down the line, and similarly for processors to find skills they want from people working at other facilities, to really connect those two.
So that's great. So I heard a lot of really interesting things today and in previous conversations I've had with all of you, but for me, a lot of it, interestingly, really revolves around values and cultures and about how employees are treated and feel they're treated in terms of not just a warm body, but having a career opportunity and being able to view our industry as a career opportunity. I don't know if we have a few minutes, if we wanted to open it up for any questions that people might have. Yes, hi. Yeah. Yeah, Ginette, did you want to start?
Sure, yeah, that doesn't surprise me at all, the number that they threw out. It is costly to replace people. So going back to culture, when you have a strong culture and when you have these core values and you really make sure that they're entrenched in the organization, our turnover rate is virtually zero. So we don't have to deal with that 46,000 per person loss. We can put that, into other things, right? Like development, like training, employee events and that. So no, that doesn't surprise me at all.
Carson, I don't know if you had anything to add on that as well.
Yeah, sure. So at our facility, which has been around for, like I said, over 100 years, it has a lot of history. Our issue isn't so much with retention, it's more with motivation, making sure that people who have been there for 20, 25 years are coming in still eager to learn, because you could lose that 40,000 just as quickly if someone who has already been taught that doesn't apply it when they're working there.
That's interesting. Ross?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, Kathleen, that I was at an event a couple of weeks ago, and one of the things that came up, it was a survey from Deloitte, and it was looking at the employment market down in the US. And over the last, I think it was 3 to 5 years, only 5% of the new hires came into full-time positions.
Wow.
So this is the sort of changing landscape, if you will, on recruitment and how staffing is going. But you've got disruptors out there such as Uber who do not have a workforce that hits the bottom line. Technically, yeah, it's skimmed off the top, but it doesn't hit the bottom line and they don't have to pay benefits.
Yeah, it's interesting. Anyone else? Yep. Hi. Yeah. 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 I'll just say a couple words first because, as I said, my board met last week and we always talk about labor, and I'm actually fascinated by the number of companies who will say that they are really actually very much interested in investing in people. So now I think one of the challenges we have, though, is that this is a big industry with a lot of companies. And to me, there's a really important question about how you take that approach to culture, value, career development, and how do you build a model that might exist in one company and actually start to be able to institutionalize it so that others can pick it up. And I think that that's a challenge we face across a lot of different policy issues that we work on. You can have, a handful of big companies who maybe institute these great policies, but most companies don't have the resources to do this. So how do we deal with that? But you guys, I know, are like way to go on this.
So to your point, that goes back to us screening core values, because core values, they don't know borders. It's worldwide. Our core values of respect, it applies to every country, to every culture. Teamwork, humility, adaptability, those are the types of things that we're looking for. So when someone applies and they don't necessarily know the Canadian customs or the way we, the Canadian culture, they still do have that fit if they have the core values and they're a team player and they have passion. Passion is another one of our core values, and you can have passion no matter what country you're from.
Sure. So my point here would be that no matter how much experience someone has, they still aren't going to know most likely the job that they're coming in to do, whether it's running a machine, whether it's running a system, a quality system, whatever it is. No one is going to know that. Experience just shows that I've done this once before, I've done this twice before, I can probably do it again. But having that attitude of I'm engaged, I know I can learn this, I can pick this up, here's how I can show you how.
And I think for me, it's the development of that future skills framework will certainly help, because employers will be able to put those competencies that they're looking for into the job posting to try and make that connect. As Carson says, it's really going to be in the fabric of the individual in terms of whether or not that's going to be a fit. And I think this is where I'm thankful at working at the University of Waterloo, where it's enabling those students to go out on various work terms to gain that experience and potentially find that fit. And that's what's looking to be more and more replicated, not just across Canada, but across the globe. We have about 3 different institutions that will come to us every month from across the globe to try and understand and find out what we do. We've even had governments visit as well. So this is where I think eventually the whole globe is going to go. And it's really, to your point, to try and find that way of not just the hard skills, but those softer skills and the overall fit for an organization.
I think there is a sort of another question that's built in there as well, which is how do we, when I take a look at these sort of key areas that we think we're going to focus on, I think one of the really hard ones for us to figure out is underrepresented groups. There are efforts going on, largely through individual companies or at local or regional levels, to tap into groups within a particular community who may not be working right now or actively engaged in the workforce but want to be. The challenge I think we face as an industry, and I just don't know the answer, and I think we really have to sit down and figure this out, is how do we take those kinds of efforts and figure out a way to roll them out more broadly, whether it's across a province or across a country? Because right now a lot of that work is very much being done either company specific. So Maple Leaf, for example, has a program at one of their plants where they partner with a local First Nations community. But because the First Nations community is in proximity close enough, they can actually set up transportation. They could go to the First Nations community and do training there. Well, how do you replicate that in other parts of the country? And I think we really, really, really have to figure out how we do that. And I think that's a piece that we really haven't even come close to yet. I wonder if there's any other question. Oh, no more questions? No more questions? I'm pulling the plug. So first of all, I really want to thank the panel for joining us here today. So Ross, Ginette, and Carson. We firmly believe at Food and Beverage Canada that there's lots of people working on the labor issue, but we really need to come together if we're going to actually resolve this problem. And coming together is about companies coming together with industry associations, groups like Food Processing Skills Canada, and also provincial and federal government. So thank you all very much, and I think we'll be around for a little while if there's any questions for myself or our wonderful panel. Thank you.